welcome to my senior mastery. Before going into my mastery topic, I would like to introduce my panel members. Beginning with Miss Franklin, she is my senior art teacher, and she's really pushed me to be the best version of myself and create artworks that challenge my skills. Moving on to Miss Compton, she is my junior art teacher, and she encouraged me to try new products, new mediums, and think of the bigger picture when creating artworks. Then we have Miss Flading, who is Miss Compton's long-term sub at the beginning of the school year. She gave me really good feedback on my master at the beginning of the school year when I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And it was really helpful. And then Miss Penn, who is my theater teacher, amazing teacher, impacted me in so many ways. I can't even count them all right now. And then Mr. Davenport, who was my physics teacher, and gave me a bunch of cool ideas about how I could incorporate physics into my artwork. My mastery is titled The Exploration of the Subconscious Human Mind. What that basically means is I'm focusing my artwork on the difficult emotions that we feel as people. As a kid, I always found that I had a hard time expressing myself through words. Because of this, I turned to making art, and as I've grown into more professional artworks, I realized that I really enjoyed making pieces that not only spoke to my own feelings, but resonated with others. This mastery topic is meaningful to me because I personally believe that art's purpose is to unite people together. And that is what I wish to accomplish. We began my presentation with the research that I've collected over these past 2 years. The first half of my research is on color perception. Color perception, or color theory, was a very interesting topic for me as I wanted to focus on pushing the hues in my works in a way that would further communicate the meaning of the piece. There are the obvious choices of blue for sad, yellow for happy, red for angry, but these are not only overused, but very watered down versions of what these colors really mean. And more importantly, colors can mean a bunch of different things, and they aren't always universal. Meanings can vary a lot between person to person. Another interesting discovery that I found about color is that it only really affects our emotions and is placed in a setting with context. Seeing a green square won't really change how you feel, but seeing something like the picture of a green piece of meat would induce a disgusting feeling. So color only expresses emotions when it's within the context of a 3D object. And this was discovered by the researchers Shannon Coy Kendall and Daniel Hoffman, and who proposed that this would be called chromatures, which is a mixture of the word chroma and textures. I also used a plethora of mediums for my pieces, so the other half of my research was on my main three mediums, acrylic, oil, and watercolor. I focused mainly on proper methods and techniques, and for the rest of the segment, I will be explaining these mediums. Underpaintings historically were created as a technique to map out the value ranges of a piece before committing to the final colors. They were also as a form of practice, as apprentices would paint the underpainting before the masters would go over and add the color. They were usually done in earthy, muddy tones because those were the cheapest to make. And today, we as artists use this technique for similar purposes. Painting the entire piece once gives your hands the muscle memory and helps the final overpainting not feel as daunting. Additionally, having the canvas be already covered in colors helps to mask thin spots in the paint and cover white spots that could be peeking through from the canvas underneath. Glazing is where you thin down your paints until translucent in order to wash a color onto the canvas. This would blend the bottom color and the top color together, tinting the hue. Historically, oil painters used this practice along with underpainting, and they would paint all the monochrome hues and then glaze on the colors on top. Doing so practically creates pre-made depth, leaving the artist to only have to deepen shadows, add highlights, and finishing touches. Scumbling involves using just a little bit of paint on your brush and scrubbing it into the canvas. This creates a spotty layer of color on top that the dried paint underneath. And doing so, when viewed from further away, our eyes visually blend the top color and the bottom color together. And this creates a more natural look, which is perfect for skin and plants. Mark making is the act of weaving visible brush strokes and intentionally creating texture without much blending. This style is often called painterly because it emphasizes that the medium is paint. A major technique that involves this method is impasto, where a piece is painted using stiff brushes, palette knives, and lots of paint in order to create texture on a canvas. It is popularized by the famous artist Vincent van Gogh. Hue shifting involves creating subtle changes in the hues of your colors, of your shadows, and your highlights. Doing so creates more depth and realism within the piece, and realistically this makes sense. When an object is shadowed, it's not because the main color itself is shadowed, but because that object is receiving less light. Yes, that makes sense. However, when you are creating art, it's not something that you would really think about when adding shadows to a piece. And so when you follow along the rules of the life in creating paintings, the paintings become more lifelike. The grid method is a technique used to transfer your reference image onto your canvas. It involves placing a grid on top of your reference image and then measuring out a matching grid onto your paper canvas that you plan on transferring the image to. Then you simply copy every small line inside the reference boxes to the corresponding squares, and this helps a lot with making sure your proportions are 1-to-1. Similarly, projection is another image transfer technique. It is rather self-explanatory. You simply use a projector and you shine your image onto your canvas, and then you trace the lines. This method is a bit less tedious and a lot more foolproof than using the grid. The grid, you can often mess up your measurements. It's terrible. The final method of image transfer that I will cover is the freehand technique. This is where you look at your image and you do your best to copy it down onto your paper without the use of any guidelines. It is the fastest, however, it is the easiest to mess up, so it's usually kept for experimental pieces where the end product isn't as important as the process. Genre paintings are artworks that depict everyday life. As opposed to landscapes and portraits, this style of painting simply shows mundane, common activities. They have been described as screenshots of life. A more well-known artist who commonly paints this style is Norman Rockwell. The point in creating pieces of these scenes is to emphasize the beauty of everyday life. I personally really enjoy this type of painting, so you will see a few of these. Another thing that is important to making art is which dimension that piece is in. 2D and 3D are obvious, being what you normally think when you think of art. However, I often found within my own pieces and the pieces of my peers that there was an obscure middle area that wasn't talked about a lot. I've decided to label it 2.5D, where a piece isn't fully flat, but it isn't exactly fully sculptured either. This would include things like relief sculptures, which is where you cut out sections of a flat sheet of material and you stick them together. Usually this is done with paper or cardboard. 2.5D can also be created by sculpting with clay onto a canvas, or by making mounds of paint like an impasto, or even adding fabric to your piece. Any 3D element placed on top of a 2D artwork would create a 2.5D end product. Finally, sustained investigations are collages of sketches, notes, color swatches, and anything that involves practice. Doing so brings all of your behind-the-scenes work into one location, making it easier to explain to others how you got to your end product. And now we move on to my influential artists. These are artists who I found myself inspired by when I was creating my artworks. The first one we have is Aurora Santica. She is a contemporary surrealist painter who uses a lot of vivid colors and detailed mark making. I find her work interesting because she packs so much symbolism and meaning into her artworks, which are interesting to study even if you aren't explicitly told what the meaning behind them is. I personally enjoy surrealistic pieces, and I'm actively trying to further push that style into my own artworks, and studying her works has been really helpful. Her use of high key colors is also astounding, and I hope to make my art even a fraction of how eye-catching hers is. My next one is Josh Fire, famously known for his acting career, but he is actually a contemporary artist, and he paints in his own style that he created called faux fauvism. This style is a play on the historical style of fauvism, which was popular in France around the turn of the 20th century, and is characterized by abstract colors and mark making with an emphasis on visible brushstrokes. Working off of this, faux fauvism uses these high-key colors and prominent mark making, but includes lots of shape and texture to create implied figures. find it really inspiring how he can create what seems to be chaos at a glance, but becomes comprehensible shapes when you take a closer look. Eric Rufontaine is my last influential artist. He's also a contemporary artist who mostly focuses on landscapes. He also enjoys surrealism artworks, but they tend to push more on the realistic style. He enjoys creating pieces that feel joyful and dreamlike, with softer, more comfortable colors. I found it interesting how you could paint such realistic imagery, yet be able to keep those fantastical elements in a way that made them look like they belonged in the environment. His style is just so uniquely pretty, and I wish to apply these same principles to my own pieces. And now we'll be moving on to my pieces. I'll begin with my 2D artworks. They will differ between concentration and breadth. Concentration works are more detailed and are specifically meant for my mastery topic, and breadth works are experimental pieces that are more relaxed, and they're not particularly for my mastery. My first one is Self-Portrait of Someone Who Doesn't Exist, and it was a piece I made during the summer. I created it to express how I felt detached from the people around me. I've always been able to make friends easily, but I find that it's hard for me to actually connect with others, even though I really want to. This sort of oxymoron has been difficult for me to express through words, so I decided to create an art piece about it. This was my first full gouache realism piece, and it was especially difficult because I was painting on a canvas. Gouache is a mix between acrylic and watercolor, so it can be opaque, but can also be thinned down with water and later reactivated after it dries. I personally like using gouache on the watery side, so I can do it in glazes and washes. However, the canvas didn't really soak up the water, so it was hard for me to paint onto it and it stay, which can be seen by the toning peeking through underneath. Once the canvas is framed, I use a spray bottle filled with water to reactivate the gouache and then let it drip to create the drip effect. My next piece is Surrender. Surrender is a piece that I completed within my junior year, and the idea behind it was based on a feeling of peace that I felt during praise and worship at my church. I wanted to visually share with others what I was experiencing. This piece was my very first watercolor painting. I used multiple different reference photos and pieced them together to create a coherent composition on my paper. It was difficult to create a piece in first-person perspective, as I wasn't sure how I was going to make it look like it was actually from my eyes. It was a good first try at watercolor, and it helped me learn a lot about the medium, and this piece was featured in art fields at Lake City in 2024. It Seems Alien was created during this summer. I wanted to do a painting of my little sister featuring her lazy eye. Lazy eye is a genetic disorder that runs in my family, and I got diagnosed with it at the age of 8. I was given eye patches that I had to wear over one eye, and I went to school every day looking like a pirate. It made me feel different and ostracized. And because of this, I wanted to create an artwork that expressed how our differences don't make us weird or lesser than, they just make us unique. I decided to freehand the composition. I was inspired by Santika's fantastical paintings, so I went for a stylized, realistic, and I changed the colors to make her look like an alien. On top of the realistic layer, I added hatching into her skin for my fantastical texture. I also tried a new method for this painting, which was taking clear acrylic medium and mixing in microcolors. And this created shiny and metallic paints that I used for highlights on her face and in her hair. If Time Was Forgiving was created during my senior year. It was for the Myrtle Beach International Airport Art Contest. And the theme was to create an artwork based off of a famous piece in Beauty Twist. I chose the piece Carnation Lily, Willie Rose by John Singer Sargent. The two girls in the original painting were the daughters of famous illustrator Frederick Bernard. And I wanted to emphasize this familial bond by making the girls in my piece me and my little sister. Further than that though, this piece is about familial relationships and wishing that you had more time with them. I often find myself too exhausted to appreciate the time that I have with my family, and it makes me feel guilty. So I wanted this piece to capture a perfect world where I could spend all of my time with the people that I love. When beginning this project, I felt intimidated by the medium that I chose, which was oil paints. Because of this, I decided to start with an acrylic underpainting, first time really limiting the base color palette to just the primaries. I focused a lot on adding hue shifting and accentuating the light from the lanterns. Brookland was my final junior piece. It features me as a toddler with children's toys set up behind me like a neighborhood. I wanted to capture how we as people tend to try and escape our troubles by losing ourselves in our imagination. I showed this through my own experiences as I did that exact same thing as a child when I was growing up. I was going through a hard time, and so I would build neighborhoods and towns in my room with my toys and make up stories about the characters and their lives, and this helped me stay distracted from what was going on. In my composition, I placed myself within one of these toy neighborhoods. I painted daisies that came out of my head and spread all over the grass as symbolism to show how my thoughts were creating this made-up reality. I first made a digital mock-up for this piece and then used the grid method. I worked really hard to create a texture difference between me and the background to emphasize their difference of imagination and reality. And this piece is currently being showcased in art fields at Lake City, South Carolina, if you'd like to go see it in person. The Little Moments is a piece from my junior year, and the idea behind it is taking the time to appreciate the mundane moments. I find that everyday life tends to get overlooked and not seen as beautiful just because it's something you see every day. However, I want to argue that these moments can be just as important and meaningful. This painting really was my first dive into creating realism, as it was my second piece from my junior year. I hue shifted this piece to have pink tones in order to give feelings of love and nostalgia. I worked really hard to create implied textures, which can be seen especially within the countertops and the window to the oven. This piece is also a genre painting. It was also featured in Bros and Shapen 2024. Objects in Mirror Are Closer Than They Appear was created in my senior year and is about unexpected love. The way that my little sister was brought into my family was unconventional. However, she has grown to become such a major part of our lives in a way that we couldn't have imagined 11 years ago. It is amazing to me how such a wonderful thing has bloomed from an uncertain time. She's the best little sister I could ever ask for, and I'm so grateful for her being in my life. I wanted to emphasize the warmth and joy, so I took my reference photo and I shifted the hues to a more orange-yellow. This works because the color shift is within the context of the visual warmth that is already in the piece. I used the grid method to transfer my image onto the canvas, and the hardest part of this piece was adding the reflections in the side of the car. However, I used glazing to create this effect. The final touch was adding the text at the bottom of the mirror. Joy is a seed and love is the pollen was my final piece that I created this year. It is meant to serve as a visual representation of how it feels when you spread joy and love others. Their happiness blooms the flowers around them, just as our happiness can help others feel good as well. I used projection to transfer my image, and however I free-handed the flower placement. I created blending by watering down my paints in order to glaze. I also used stumbling to achieve a similar self-blend. The flowers have a bit of impasto elements as I built them up with the paint so that they would have a slight 3D effect. And after I finished painting the entire piece, I added hue shifting into the highlights and the shadows of their fabric in order to simulate the colors of their surroundings reflecting onto them. Passing Down Love is a piece from my senior year. I wanted to depict the age-old tradition of teaching skills from generation to generation. My grandmother taught my mom to bake. My mom taught me to love reading, and I'm teaching my little sister to enjoy creativity. I find this deep-rooted need to share what you love with others to be very heartwarming. I projected to transfer my reference image, and then began with the red acrylic gouache underpainting. Acrylic gouache is basically gouache, but it's not able to be rehydrated after it dries. And using this medium was very important to my final piece because I wanted to simulate the historical method of glazing the base colors over your underpainting. If I had used normal watercolor or gouache, the top layers would have picked up the underpainting and made all my colors muddy. So that's why I did that. I focused a lot on adding hue shifting to create depth, and this piece is also a genre painting. It is currently being displayed at Bros and Shapen here in investigation for the painting, I really wanted to capture this piece as realistic as I could, so I practiced a lot with different kinds of watercolor, methods of underpainting, and styles of hue shifting. Now moving on to more of my experimental 2D and 2.5D paintings. Pumpkin Patch is a breathwork that I created in my senior year. I made this in plein air, which means that I was in person looking at the landscape as I painted it. Because of this, I had no reference picture, so the composition was free-handed. I was inspired to do this by my influential artist, Blue Fontaine, as he travels around the world in order to get inspiration for his pieces. I thought it would be fun to do the same. However, painting this scene by just looking at it proved to be difficult because I was working in an active pumpkin patch and people were buying the pumpkins. I find myself working against time to paint this piece before all of the pumpkins were shipped in and moved. I focused mainly on adding as much hue shifting and mark making elements as possible in order to create visual interest. Flowers in the 2.5 is my main piece from this year that really focused on creating a 2.5D artwork. I used cornstarch as a thickening agent and white paint so that I could sculpt these shapes onto my canvas. I call this faux impasto because it's meant to recreate the look of impasto, but is created using a different method. This goal was to make the flowers look like they were coming out of the canvas. I worked hard to add a variety of textures to the flowers, and once I was done adding the texture, I painted over it as I normally would. Penny by the Fire was created in my senior year. It was my first alcohol marker piece, so I thought it would be fun to play around with all of the different colors. I chose a reference picture with dramatic lighting, so I could emphasize the range of the colors. I found that it was hard to blend the markers, so I decided to leave this piece gestural and add mark-making elements. I ended up loving how it made the colors feel so dynamic. Eli Up for a Crane was created in my senior year. After making Penny by the Fire, I found that I really liked this medium and I wanted to try it again on a larger scale. I chose another piece with dramatic lighting in order to practice hue shifting, and I deliberately chose alcohol markers as the medium to practice because I found that it was similar enough to watercolor that it helped me better understand how the colors work together when layered in thin layers. I also attempted glazing in this piece, and I achieved that by mixing a tiny bit of my marker ink into a small pot of rubbing alcohol, and I used this mixture as a thin base coat in order to tone the piece and create color harmony. Caring for Each Other is a piece that I created this year. I had originally wanted to do just a normal oil study. However, I quickly realized that the tiny paintbrushes that I had on hand were too soft to create the textures that I was looking for. And because of this, I shifted my focus onto impasto. And I mainly used a large stiff brush and my palette knife to apply the paint onto the canvas. In order to get into the really small details, I used a spiky clay tool that I had in my room to manipulate the paint to lay how I wanted it to. I found that I really loved this effect, and it was the start of me getting into a big impasto phase at the end of my senior year. Night Has Fallen was my very first piece ever in my junior year. I never painted anything so detailed before, and I had no prior research, so this piece was a big struggle for me. I tried out many different poses and angles in little thumbnail sketches before choosing this one as my favorite composition. I purposefully chose dark, cool colors for inside the room so that the bit of area behind the door could have a sharp contrast. Despite my lack of knowledge on techniques, I liked the texture that I was able to create in this piece. Mountain Laurels was painted in my junior year. It was my first ever oil painting, so I had a lot of help from my friend Mac when getting started. I chose 3 different reference pictures, and I took my favorite flowers from every reference picture and photoshopped them together to create one composition. This piece took very long for me because I had no prior knowledge of this medium, leaving me to have to learn from trial and error. Siphons as Paper Crafts is a breathwork that I created this year. I had originally wanted to paint a gouache impasto piece. However, my first attempt showed me that gouache cracks when it's layered thickly. Because of this, I restarted and painted the piece normally. I really wanted to emphasize the spotlight lighting. In my own house, this is my front door, and on the wall right next to it is a circle mirror. And at the perfect time every morning, the light shines through the window in the door, hits the mirror, and creates that perfect little spotlight on the paper crafts. I wanted to create a piece of this because I made those paper crafts with my siblings and my babysitter when I was younger, and it really meant a lot to me that the light was doing such a pretty thing to it. Come sit with us is the chalk art piece that me and my friend Mac made for the 2025 Chalk Day at AAST. For those who don't know, Chalk Day is basically where all of the art majors spend the entire day outside creating a piece of work on the sidewalk blocks outside of our school. Last year, Mac and I were inspired by folklorism. However, this year, we decided to go completely different and create a piece that looked like a picnic blanket was laid on the sidewalk. To complement the picnic blanket, I created food props with foam and fabric, which we placed on top after the piece was completed. This made our piece into the only 2.5D artwork that was created during Chalk Day this year. And this is the same image but blown up so you can get a better view of the details. Unfortunately, chalk washes away, so I was unable to bring it in here. And now moving on to my 3D artworks. An out-of-body experience was created during the summer. It's meant to depict the feeling of disassociation, which is something that I personally struggle with. I get so lost in my head that I forget to ground myself in reality and remember that everything really is temporary. I purposefully gave this piece a sterile and inorganic feeling by utilizing straight lines in the composition. I began by cutting out cardboard squares. Each would get smaller by an inch, creating the illusion of the hallway getting further away. And I turned this into a cardboard relief piece by adding extra layers of cardboard to make the hallway look a little more three-dimensional. They were painted in a way that made the pieces get darker the further they were from the viewer. And these are more pictures of it. One is of another angle to show how they are set up on the base plate, and the other is a progress photo. Broken and Mended was my final summer work. The idea behind this piece was physically showing how it feels to live with a chronic illness. I started developing carpal tunnel after the very first work of my junior year. It has since gotten worse and has hindered my ability to create art and do the things that I love. A big inspiration for this piece was the Japanese art of kintsugi, which is where broken pottery is mended with gold. It is believed that in doing so, the repairs honor the life of the pottery and even make them more valuable. The pieces of the hand were all held together with golden wire, reflecting the practice of kintsugi. I wanted this piece to be an inspiration for both myself and others to show that our journeys make us stronger. I casted the hand with plaster and broke it into pieces with a hammer. I then chose where I wanted the wires to be and drove holes into the plaster. To attach the base of the wrist to the pedestal, I drove 2 holes into both the wood and the plaster before filling them with epoxy and placing in 2 screws. This created a very strong bond. The wires and the plaster pieces were held together with epoxy as well. Here are some progress photos. On the left is the mold, in the middle is the handed pieces, and on the right is the pieces all attached with the wire. Redemption was created during my junior year, and the idea behind it was capturing the feeling of being freed from the past. I began with a cardboard mock-up, and the hands were sculptured out of clay with a wire armature inside, and then the glass shards were glued together to look like flames. I found boxes for the top and bottom pieces, and then had plexiglass rectangles cut before sanding down the edges to give them a cleaner finish. The plexiglass simply slotted into place, and the end pieces were attached to each side. LEDs were also placed inside, so the sculpture can light up. Here's a picture of it lit up, and the cardboard mock-up that I created in the process. Perception and the Reflection was the last 3D sculpture that I created this year. It is meant to be a visual representation of how other people's words can affect us. One mean comment can warp someone's perception of themselves for years. One passing sentence to you could be a mantra in the mind of another. It's important to not only be conscious of what you say, but to also realize that other people's comments don't define who you are. I sculpted the figures out of Sculpey Ultralight clay, and then built the mirror out of balsa wood. The reflective part of the mirror was made by placing mirror vinyl sheets on both sides of a piece of craft foam, and the finishing touch was adding the sentences onto the mirror, which were created with a label maker and then cut down to size. Here are more angles of this piece. This was my sustained investigation of my process when creating this piece. And finally, my closing statements. The time that I spent here exponentially grew my skills as an artist, because this environment had me wanting to push myself to get better and try new things. I originally didn't care too much for the competitions. However, submitting artworks and going to the art galleries was so inspiring. I found myself in an area of artists supporting artists, and it truly helped me realize how much I needed to get into this world. Being in this major has also impacted my social skills positively. Not only did I grow more in creativity, but also in community involvement, professionalism, and collaboration. We participated in events like Trunk or Treat and Chalk Day, and two of my friends and I even volunteered to paint a mural for a local church. We learned how to talk with others, as visitors would come by often and be curious about our artworks. We spent the entirety of these 2 years collaborating and talking with each other about our ideas for potential works, which only helped strengthen both the outcome of the pieces and our bonds that we have together as friends. My advice to any rising junior or senior is to stay proactive. The environment is an ever-evolving one, and that means you have to be evolving with it. Do not let yourself get behind, and work hard to produce quality works, because it will pay off in the end. Overall, I really enjoyed my time here. This was such an amazing experience and an amazing opportunity that has changed my life. This fall, I will be attending Horry County Technical College for a certification in phlebotomy and an associate's degree in medical laboratory technology. I know that sounds a bit out of left field, since I am an art major, but it's for a good reason. There's a current lack of people working in the medical field, and I've personally dealt with having myself and family being unable to get the help that they need. And I felt like I needed and I wanted to help bridge that gap. Having this education will also help me set up so that I can be able to move anywhere and be able to find a stable, well-paying job that can help fuel my love for creating art. And with the skills that I have learned from this major, I am certain that I will be able to exceed in this workforce. Thank you so much to all of my teachers, family, and friends. I could not have been able to do this without you guys. Sorry. I will now take